But first, the fallout from the shooting at a Parkland, Florida high school on Wednesday that killed 17 people is turning into a student-led mass movement against guns. And now President Trump is signaling he may favor gun control legislation. Students are involved in the planning at least in 4 major upcoming protests, including a march on Washington next month. Parkland, Florida students who survived last week's shooting are taking to the airwaves to promote the new campaign.
The tragedy at Stoneman Douglas was not because of Stoneman Douglas. It was because people like Nicholas Cruz were able to buy these weapons. We're not going to let the 17 bullets we just took take us down. If anything, we're going to keep running, and we're going to lead the rest of the nation behind us.
Meanwhile, President Trump reportedly was moved by the sight of Parkland victims during a visit to the hospital on Friday and discussed gun control options with friends over the weekend. This morning, the White House announced the president supports legislation to strengthen the federal background check system. While the measure is relatively modest and not yet opposed by the NRA, it could be a sign of more ambitious gun control efforts to come. Let's discuss this with former House Oversight Committee Chairman Jason Chaffetz and Democratic strategist Antoine Seawright. Jason, Congressman, you were in Congress for a long time, not too long, but long enough. What can you do, if anything, to make sure this doesn't happen again?
Well, I wish there was one thing we could do to make sure that it never, ever happens again. But I do like this idea of fixing the National Instant Background System. If you go to the website fixnics.org, you'll see that the Shooting Sports Foundation and others support this. I supported it when I was in Congress. It's passed out of the House, I believe, and it has bipartisan support. In the Senate, it makes sense. There are some people who can't distinguish between right and wrong, and they shouldn't be able to acquire a gun. I have a gun. I have 5 guns. I have a concealed carry permit. I am a member of the NRA. But people who can't make these types of decisions shouldn't be able to access a gun. And when this guy gets kicked out of school, obviously has problems, the police come to his house 30 times, there's a problem in him accessing a gun. And
just to give the viewers and the audience a little more context on what you're discussing with the Fix NICS program, currently it is not required by federal law that states input mental health records into the background check system. And mentally adjudicated or committed individuals cannot, at this point, buy or purchase a gun. It's prohibited. There's a question about it on the background check form when you purchase a gun. This legislation required that states do that, so there's not that gap in the system. But Antoine, you have a different take. You're going after the firearms rather than necessarily states inputting these mental health records. Why do you think we're in this position? And is blaming the NRA and accusing them of being on the side of murderers really forwarding this conversation?
Well, let me tell you where I am. I am on the side of common sense gun reform measures being implemented in this country. I have zero confidence in Washington, D.C., dysfunctional city to get this done. I think we have to lean heavily on local legislative bodies and even local governments, like here in Columbia, South Carolina, where I'm from, where the mayor and the city council in a very unified way ban the selling of bump stocks. But here's what I think. Keep in mind, it was this president who signed an executive order to reverse a decision that implemented by the Obama administration to take guns out of the hands of those who have mental illness issues.
I'm really glad you brought that up, because that's actually not true. What President Trump did was rescind an executive order by President Obama that said that Social Security recipients and veterans who wanted someone to help them with their finances were then deemed mentally unfit and therefore unable to pass a background check, and their Second Amendment rights were taken away with due process. So to say that he took something back that now enables mentally ill people to get a gun just isn't true. Jason, I want to go back to you. I want to go back to you real quickly. We heard a whole lot about new gun control measures and people saying that this is an issue of making sure we take certain kinds of firearms off of the streets. There's also the other side of the argument that we haven't heard as much about. There are students in that school who don't like being sitting ducks. There are a number of teachers who are members of the NRA. There are a number of NRA members who have children who go to these schools who believe that they are soft targets and that things need to be changed. What do you say about school districts around the country who have decided to allow teachers to be armed inside of their classrooms?
No, look, you got some teachers that can't negotiate a Bunsen burner, so it's not for everybody. But I think these are soft targets. You got to be able to make sure that individuals can't get into that school in the first place. One of the reports we heard out of Florida is they had some bulletproof glass or some hardened glass, so he couldn't actually shoot out the window and shoot at students that were fleeing. But you're going to have a resource officer. Maybe it's a police officer who's on duty or off duty who knows how to wield a gun. And I do believe that certain teachers in certain places should and can be equipped. They do it in Colorado. They do it in other places. And I think it's a good idea for a lot of places. And by the way, Baltimore, Chicago, and Washington, D.C. have some of the most stringent rules and laws. Yeah, well, that's true. Yeah. And they have some of the biggest problems with guns.
Anton, you want to respond to that? Is that an irrelevant point? Is that not a relevant point to bring up? And the fact that Chicago's had hundreds of murders in 2017, and yet it's not in the headlines every day?
It's the go-to Republican pivot talking point.
Is it not true?
Let me tell you what I think.
Is it not true?
But it's true. It's true, isn't it?
It's the go-to Republican pivot talking point.
Is it true or not? True or false?
But is it true?
Let me tell you what reasonable people want. They want to not have AK-47s on the street. A 19-year-old who can't rent a car or buy wine should never be able to purchase an AK-47. Reasonable people want to close the Charleston loophole. So for instance, my friend Clemente Pinckney, who was killed in a church here in Charleston, South Carolina. So that will not happen again. Reasonable people want to ban bump stocks. The reasonable things that people want to do instead of the traditional pivot to talk about Baltimore and Chicago the red meat talking points.
You talk about being reasonable. Is it unreasonable to think that places like Chicago and Baltimore that have all of the gun control legislation you could possibly ask for would not be the examples that we should follow considering their murder rates?
Sure, but here's what I would tell you. I'm not saying gun control is the all-out, be-out final answer, but I think it will be part of the solution to the problem in this country to prevent another Charleston, to prevent another Newtown, to prevent another Parkland, Florida.
All right, we've seen that hasn't worked, but Jason, last word to you.
No, hey, look, I would get rid of bump stocks as well, but there is a lot of education that needs to go on. But I own guns. I have a constitutional right to own guns, but there's got to be a way to find people who are mentally unfit to be able to. They shouldn't be able to purchase them, and if they run into trouble, then they should take those guns away. This kid should have never had it, and they got to tie all those loops together.
Right. Well, Jason, Anton,
you would agree that we do not need AK-47s on the street, right?
I think that's an overstatement of the situation. But thank you to you both for coming on the show tonight.
I do not
appreciate
agree with that.
it. Thank you.